Welcome. Here's some ideas on creating your own intro to yoga course or a beginner's course or classes on an ongoing basis with a few principles that we can use, which I've written on my phone. So the first thing that I wanted to share is this idea of layering up the postures. So if you think of any pose, you can think of the different simple movements that go into it and then add those movements together to make more complex poses. And if we teach each movement individually, it means that you can kind of see if there's any particular problem area for someone, and then they can stay with a more simple version of the pose rather than adding it on to be more complex poses. So for example, if you're having revolved triangle, you could have somebody pause with the forward fold action here rather than coming also into the twist. Yeah, or they might even have a forward fold that was a bit more close together or hands on the wall, more supported, that kind of thing. So in other words, if you think of each of those single movements, so like the forward fold as one and then the twist as the other, then you can kind of choose which ones to add together or not. This ties in with the second principle or idea of using loops or sequences which effectively repeat the same key movements from perhaps more simple action or iteration of that pose to a more complex or challenging one as the class progresses, but also as the weeks progress, obviously. So quite a simple example might be, say, from low lunge pose, Anjaneyasana. If you were teaching class, you might start everyone here, and then you might do a few other poses, adding onto that, a little low, whatever you're doing. And then you might loop through another kind of series of postures, but perhaps the second time through coming to high lunge, you might loop through again, and then on the third time you come to warrior one pose. So again, the advantage is that people can revisit the version that was really suiting them. They don't have to go onto the more complex pose or more demanding pose. And they'll know where they were going. Especially at the beginning of class, we tend to go in a little bit more deep with some alignment principles or some teaching points. And you can just invite people to revisit this pose if you prefer. It might be nice to stay with those students to kind of do the more simple pose, briefly showing the more complex and then jumping back so they kind of feel like they've got a friend with them in those more simple iterations of the poses. But generally then you'll find that students will feel happy to stay with what's really working in their bodies, especially if you're explaining well how that is. Useful to really stay in a way that feels easeful. So you might tie in with some of the philosophy. If we stay with that same example, you can imagine how beyond the beginners or beyond an intro course later on, that warrior one pose might develop further into, let's say, we've got shoulder flexion and hip extension. You can see how it would relate to the back bend. So you might have this big loop of postures and think, oh, this pose also could work into Urdhva Dhanurasana, so like full back bend pose, upward bow pose, or even you can see where it would tie in with a warrior three pose or something like that. So it's not that it only works for quite simple postures. We can use the same principle the whole way through our teaching. And in that way, it means we can teach quite multi-layered classes for students who have got different physical needs and abilities. Saying all of that, the other point that I wanted to make is that this progression, in inverted commas, is not about the postures as such, but about that internal experience of yoga, or that experience of interconnectedness or connecting to oneself, or however you perceive yoga to be, whatever your understanding of yoga is. And that essentially that being yoga, that being integrated and in contact with self, is the same experience for everyone, regardless of what the postures look like. So it means that as we teach class, as we teach this incredible practice, we can encourage people to be deepening internally rather than encouraging necessarily always the expression of the pose, this external form, as being the yoga. In other words, just integrating the teaching of yoga through the asana. So, additionally, I thought we could just look at how within any single pose we can make the posture look feel a little bit more gentle or a bit stronger, and we can offer that to everyone so that they can find their iteration of the pose. So let's say, for example, we were taking triangle pose and everybody was able to come in this way. Then you can see that if we add more load, in other words, more weight bearing, that's going to feel stronger, or more flexibility is going to require more strength of movement as well to get all the way down, all the way up, as well as, of course, more mobility in the body. So we might think of triangle as needing perhaps some props. You could use a chair or a brick. Feel free to just join in for a little exploration of Trikonasana. So we could come in and just keep the arms quite low. The higher you go with your arms, the more load it's going to be. In other words, the more weight bearing through the body. So here, or demonstrating quite high with the arm. As soon as we demonstrate going to the ground, for example, students' shoulders might drop forward. They might feel less steady, less open across the chest. So using a hand on leg or bricks or chair if you have those. And then the longer we go, so if we take the arms open, we've obviously got a little bit more weight bearing, but we can still support all the way through to perhaps having the arms not connected to the legs, with less load here or here. And we could even load up with some sort of proppage like this. And then ask people to really lift. Doesn't look like it's super heavy, but it gives a whole different stimulus coming into the pose, and then pushing through the feet and reaching, and turning the chest. Starts to get quite a lot stronger, even though it doesn't necessarily look like it could. So because there's so many options with every posture, and we don't want to be confusing ourselves too much and our students, you may just want to really have a look around the room and think, okay, this student's quite strong, they like working quite hard, and give them like a really strong version. And then perhaps someone else is kind of in the middle. So you don't need to give every single example every time, is what I'm saying. The other thing that can work really well is just to give a couple of examples and then say, or anything else that suits you or that you feel you might need. It actually ties in then with trauma-sensitive teaching, because that empowerment, that giving the control and the agency to each individual is part of trauma-sensitive teaching. So that can work really well on that dual level also. So I hope that those are useful pointers for you in terms of this sequencing of any class really, and of making it really available in a way that feels both inclusive, but also that ties in with some of those deeper teachings of yoga. Thank you.